Greetings, everyone. My name is Adam Hems, and I'm the leader of the Houston Azure User Group. A warm welcome to everyone, both in person, hello, and online. Greetings. Actually, I'm waving at the camera. I couldn't get the camera to work, so you just have to hear me. So a warm welcome. So who here is its first time? So Peter's not, yeah, second time. Tom's first time. Yes, a welcome. Tom, but all right. So for Tom's benefit and potentially anyone who's online, the intent of this group, I've been running it since 2015, and it's a community. This is a hobby of mine. I took it over from the predecessor who moved out of town. And the focus of this group is an opportunity for folks to learn from one another, from our speakers, often colleagues, as in this case, sometimes members of the community as well. We've had many of those. Sometimes we've actually had more than once a presentation by a member of the community who then became a colleague, and that was fun. So we've had repeat presenters, we've had all kinds of things. We try and do it on the second Tuesday of every month, covering a variety of Azure topics, all kinds of things that are of interest, and it's mostly here about learning. So what this very specifically isn't is a sales pitch. So if you're here to be sold to, you're in the wrong place. But if you're here to learn from the speaker and from one another, you're in the right place. And that's really the intent of our group. So my day job is as a cloud architect with Microsoft. And I spent all day, every day, working in this set of technologies. I enjoy it very, very much. And so this is an opportunity for me to engage in a more informal setting on learning and working with folks in a way that is different in a different forum. So I enjoy this very much. And it's always fun to meet and chat with people as well. That's always good, and have some pizza. So with that, I will hand it. So another thing, if we're in person, is that we need sponsorship so that we get to eat. And this month, the food was sponsored by Avanade. So even though they're not even here, they're in the building, but they were kind enough to sponsor us anyway. So a round of applause for Avanade, please, for feeding us. So we're very grateful for their support. Okay, with that then, I'll hand over to our speaker, Marlo. You're up, sir.
Can you hear me now?
Sure.
Is that a good audio level?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, if we need to fix the audio, just let me know. If you need to change how I look, sorry, that's all I got, right?
Perfect.
And let's see. I think we're gonna mute.
I'll do the muting.
You're gonna take them, and you'll also keep an eye on the chat or hands raised, something like that. Okay, great. Thank you, Adam, for that intro. Let me get over here. Hope my computer didn't go to sleep. This is a great start.
Yay. Oh, that's awesome.
So while we're waiting for that, I'll introduce myself briefly. My name is Marlo Bell. I'm also a cloud architect with Microsoft. A little bit about my background. I've been working with Microsoft technologies for about 15 years, maybe 16 years now. I spent a long time working in the SharePoint world in both a developer and a infrastructure perspective. And then I moved over, started working with Office 365 for a few years, and then moved over and started working with Azure for about 5 years now. Do I keep bumping this? Is that what I'm doing?
Yeah, you're not gonna.
Okay, I'll try and do better. I'm sorry. Let's dispense with that slide. I blame your clouds, Adam. It's the moving clouds. It's killing my computer. Okay, I introduced myself. Okay, so we're going to talk about a few things of governance, a few different aspects of it. We're going to go from kind of a 100 level, cruise down to a 200 level. We might dabble in the 300 level. If you have questions, raise your hand. Let's talk at them then and there. So we talk about cloud operating model. You got to think about, okay, what are you actually trying to do in the cloud? Let me build out this next slide. Traditionally, we're going to think of kind of different scales of what we're doing in the cloud, right? A workload, you might call it an application. It might be a group of applications. You're going to bundle those together. You're going to put them in Azure. They're all nicely tight and coupled. Great, that's a workload. Is that the only thing you're doing in Azure? Okay, great. Move your workload to Azure. Most companies, especially companies that are interested in scale, that's not all you're doing in Azure. You're not just moving one application. You're moving perhaps all of your applications, or at least many applications. So you start putting multiple workloads in the cloud. Well, at that point, you need to start getting some plumbing in place. All right, how do we do it with reusing certain things to save money, or to kind of get some baseline security things in place? What tools are we going to use to get some efficiency and how quickly we can deploy? That's where you move over to maybe the landing zone concept. And then as you get even bigger, maybe you have a very diverse business, different countries, different geographies, just very different business lines. You might need multiple landing zones. You might need a landing zone that is focused on SAP, a different landing zone that's traditional apps, and one that's maybe legacy apps or something like this. As that grows, so does your complexity, obviously. Let me build out this next slide as well. And so does your governance and your operations, those challenges. I'm going to move this again. Let me know if that audio is not good. If you're just moving one application, you probably don't need to overthink governance, right? You still need to do it, but you probably don't need a committee of people doing governance, and you don't need different teams doing different aspects of governance, right? It's probably the team that's moving that one workload. They know what they need to do. They know how to do it securely, and you get them some best practices and away they go. Again, we're talking about scale, and most companies, they're actually going to start kind of in that lower left, like, hey, we want to move to the cloud, and they move one thing, and then they move another thing, and then they move another thing, right? So start with the end in mind. Think about, okay, where are we going to be eventually? Even if you start with the end in mind, you're going to have growing pains, right? Nobody wants to go invest $1 million in this huge platform program, hire 20 people when you don't have that many workloads on the cloud there yet. So plan on growing. But the point of this that I'm trying to get across is that you got to find what's right for you, right? If you're a Fortune 5 company, you're probably towards the right of this slide. If you're a startup, you're probably towards the left, and your investment's gonna match that. I apologize. I keep breathing on the microphone. Let's talk about governance in Azure specifically. There are 5 governance principles within the Cloud Adoption Framework that Microsoft publishes. A lot of what we're going to talk about today weaves in and out of several of these, especially this top line of security baseline, resource consistency, and cost management. Identity baseline, we're just going to barely scratch the surface on that. We could spend a week just studying identity and governance of identity. We don't have that time, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about deployment acceleration. So we're going to talk, and again, we're going to focus on Azure policy, and it's going to weave in and out of those top 3. To understand everything we're going to talk about today, you need to understand scopes in Azure. If you've been using Azure for a while, you know all this, right? So this is a review for you. I apologize. A scope in Azure is basically a hierarchy, and you can go from a management group, which is could be a collection of other management groups, or it could just hold subscriptions. A subscription is a nice demarcation from a security perspective, from a billing perspective. It's a good place to separate workloads. You can separate workloads at that next lower level, which is a resource group. And inside a resource group, you put your resources, right? You put your databases, you put your storage accounts, you put your virtual machines, okay? So whenever I use the word scope, I mean one of those 4 things. And you can choose, right? If you want to affect a change across your entire Azure footprint, you probably do that at a high scope, at a management group level. If you want to do that at a very small scope, you're going to do that perhaps at a resource or perhaps at a resource group level. Okay, maybe you guys knew that. Just keep that visual in your mind because it'll come back in play. Let's touch on identity a little bit. This is one of the ways, and honestly, it's probably the first way that you need to do governance in Azure. You need to think about who has what permissions, right? Hopefully not everybody has global admin, right? If everybody has global admin, you probably need to rethink some of your governance strategy around identity, right? So in Azure specifically, we talk about role-based access control. And that is managed through what would be called a role assignment. I like this slide because it talks about the who, the what, and the where. You need all three of those things for a role assignment. If you're missing one, it all falls apart, right? John has contributor. Where does John have contributor? Think of those scopes, right? At a management group level, at a subscription level, at a resource group level. Something to keep in mind is that those permissions, let's say we give John contributor at a subscription, those permissions are going to cascade down to everything underneath it. That's really critical. And there's no break inheritance type of thing. Like, hey, I want John to have permissions down this hierarchy, except for this one thing right here. That doesn't exist. So you really have to plan out, okay, if I give John that permission, am I okay with him having that permission on everything underneath that scope? Okay, so I mentioned contributor as a role. There are some built-in roles. They're like kind of the classic built-in roles. You know, they're really easy to use. There's owner, which can do basically everything. There's contributor, they can do everything an owner can do except for manage permissions. And then there's reader, which is just what it sounds like, right? You can read, right? Those are the classic three. You need to ask yourself, are those the right permissions to use? You know, a lot of people will think to themselves, well, contributor is not owner, which is true, and that's a good thing, but contributor is still really, really powerful. It means they can do basically anything, right? They could spin up a VM that costs $10,000 a month, right? Because they're a contributor, they can do those things. They could take down production because they're a contributor, they can do those things. So the first part of governance is controlling permissions and who can do what where, right? If you've been in the Windows world for a long time, this is probably not a new concept, right? It goes back to, you know, Windows NT of having who, the what, the where, and managing those permissions. It's no different in Azure. The difference comes in that a lot of the access has been democratized within Azure, right? You want to get your developers access to the tools quickly, you know, let them build, right? But are you going to allow them to do things maybe that are dangerous or that you don't necessarily want them to do? Okay. We're going to do a quick demo here. Role-based access control. Okay. You got my browser, all right? Let's go here. We're going to just go to the portal. And again, if you've seen this before, you know, tune out for 30 seconds and then come on back. The way I like to organize my Azure portal is I like to show that scope hierarchy in this left nav, right? So I see management groups, subscriptions, resource groups, resources. So just to give a quick example of RBAC, I'm going to go into this subscription called applications. I'm going to go into access control. From here, there's several different things you can do, right? I can view my access, say, okay, what permissions do I have? You can see I have quite a few. It's because this is my tenant. I'm the only administrator, so I have a lot of things, right? You can see owner. Okay, we've talked about that one. And then you can see some of these others, Azure Kubernetes Service Administrator, Key Vault Administrator. These are built-in roles provided by Microsoft, just like owner, contributor, reader, but they're scoped down to something a little bit more limited. So remember how I said, do you really want to give contributor to everybody? Maybe, you know, especially if you're a small startup and you've got 3 guys, you know, you probably going to have some contributors. If you're an enterprise, you probably don't want everybody to have contributor. And you can use these built-in roles provided by and managed by Microsoft and give them just the permissions they need to do their job. So for example, you might give like an operations team the ability to log into a virtual machine, but not the ability to delete that virtual machine, right? You can do that with these built-in roles. If we want to see what are the role assignments on this particular scope, I can come in here for role assignments. And this is going to show me a few different things. It's going to show me permissions that are inherited from a higher scope. It's going to show me permissions that are at this scope. It's not necessarily going to be permissions that might be assigned at a lower scope. So if, like I'm looking at a subscription here, right? If there's a permission granted at resource level, I'm not going to necessarily see that in this screen. I can go find that through some other mechanisms, but just for brevity, I'm going to say, let's look at this resource. And remember, this is the subscription. And you can see what permissions are directly assigned here. So remember, when I clicked on what access do I have, that was looking at me. Now I'm actually looking at that scope directly to say what has permissions here. You can see all that. And you know, to be honest, as you start to do governance, you got to ask yourself, is this right? Is this really the permissions that should exist here? And so you got to dive in and think about that. Let's say we want to add a new one. Pretty straightforward. I'm just going to add a little assignment. You can see here there's lots of different role assignments. Most of these are built in. You can see that it says built in. And if you really want to know what does that actually do, you can click on view over here on the left. And it's sometimes easiest just to visualize it in the JSON. And it will tell you, okay, Ag Food Platform Service Admin, here's the permission that it has, right? And then you can go look at the documentation, understand, okay, what does that actually mean, you know, in plain English. That might not be the most interesting role to look at, but you can look at them and see what they are. You can also build a custom one. Let's say I have a really strict security requirement, you know, something that Microsoft hasn't thought of or would not think of because it's a very unique situation, unique to me as a customer. You can go ahead and build your own JSON and say, here are the exact permissions that I want this role to have, and then you can assign that out. So for this case, I'm just gonna go with that. Let's go with Ag Food Platform Sensor Partner.
Virtual machine contributor.
Oh, okay. Something more practical. Adam wants virtual machine contributor.
Okay. How do I find that?
Let's do a search, shall we? Virtual machine. Which one did you say? Contributor. Okay. Just to make Adam happy, let's look at this one because it might be a little more interesting than something ag related. I don't know. Ag's kind of interesting. Aha. There's some things more to look at. Okay. They can contribute a lot of things. They can do a lot of things all around compute. What you're not going to see in here is like key vault, for example. They can't go mess with the key vaults. Those are something you probably want to protect. They can't mess with, I was going to say SQL, but there is some sort of SQL virtual machine in here. They can't mess with Azure SQL, the PaaS service. How about that? They don't have that permission. Okay.
Tags, right? I don't think tags is in there.
Let's see.
Tags.
Don't see it. Okay. From this point, it's really quite plug and play, right? We're going to go contributor. Who do we want to give it to? Let's give it to admin. Of course, give it to admin. He has all the permissions. Select. So at this point, we have the where, because that's where we started. We started at the subscription. We have the what, we're given virtual machine contributor, and we have the who, that user. Review and assign, says, okay, looks like you want to do these things, are you sure? Away we go. Okay, pretty straightforward, especially if you've been in the Microsoft world since Windows NT. The key points there are really that they cascade down. and you can't break permissions at some point to say, well, everywhere except for here. And you can get really, really granular if you need to. Let's talk about some best practices. Okay, here's some recommendations for your permissions. And some of these aren't like, hey, this is what you do. It's going to say you need to decide what to do, right? Some of these recommendations are you as a company, based upon your scope, your size, you're going to figure this out, right? Define your admin and your developer permissions, right? Who has, let's say, platform administrators, right? What permissions do they have? What are the processes they need to go to? What's the logging that's involved? Do they need to elevate permissions using, some sort of a checkout process or privileged identity management to elevate permissions? How about your developers? Are your developers doing deployments in production? Or are you restricting that to say, no, only the pipeline has permissions to deploy in production? Developers, you have permissions in, let's say, a sandbox environment, right? You got to think through those. If you don't think through them, they'll be thought through for you, and you'll be cleaning it up after the fact. Prefer built-in roles. As I mentioned, Microsoft creates those and manages those for you. You can do. I'm not saying don't do custom roles. I'm just saying have a reason for it. See if there's a built-in role that meets your need, and if not, okay, create a custom role. But those should be probably the exception more than the rule. Balance least privilege permissions concept. This is a hard one, right? This is your operations teams versus your cybersecurity team, right? Cybersecurity team says lock it down as much as possible. Give John the ability to do only what his job should be allowed to do at that given moment. One of the problems with that is that John's a human, and his job can change. His responsibilities from week to week might be slightly different. It's hard to anticipate exactly what John might need to do. However, let's talk about like a service principal, a service ID. A service ID is, you probably know exactly what it's going to do, and that's the only thing it's going to do. You can lock those babies down, and then if it needs to do something else, there's probably going to be a change control process around that to say, hey, this service principal is now going to do these other things. Let's make sure it has permissions to do those other things as well. So if you tried to lock down a user, like, hey, that's great if you succeed. However, because of the dynamic nature of people and people's jobs, you've got to balance that with what can we actually achieve from an operations perspective. Are we going to have to hire a guy who does nothing but services tickets of developers or admins that need incremental little adjustments to their permissions? So that's what I mean by balance. I don't mean don't do least privilege. I mean balance it. The last bullet point on here too is limit the use of the owner and the user access administrator roles. The reason why those two is those can manage permissions. If you don't manage owner and user access administrator, you don't manage anything from a permissions perspective, because it will spread like wildfire. John has owner, he gives owner to Sally or contributor to so-and-so, and you have no idea what's there, who's doing what, why they're doing it. So really take note of owner and user access administrator. Okay. Let's move on to Azure policy. This is where we're going to spend the bulk of the time tonight. We're going to get fairly deep. If I'm going too fast, Adam will keep me honest. I'm confident of that, right? So Azure policy structure, you just need to kind of take a mental image of this. We can come back to this slide if we need to. And we're going to start kind of at the middle. So it all starts with a policy definition. And just think of this as a rule or a control. Thou shalt do this. Thou shalt not do this, right? You codify that into some JSON. It looks a lot like ARM, but it's not exactly ARM. Has some similar elements. You say, okay, here's a policy. Thou shalt do this or thou shalt not do this. Great. You can bundle those up into an initiative. You might see it called a policy set in some of the documentation, or in PowerShell. You'll definitely see it called a policy set. It's a set of policies. It's an initiative. Same, right? If you want, you can do a grouping within that policy set. let's say you're doing a policy that's kind of an operational type policy, and you've got 4 tagging policies. You might just group them and say, yep, these are my tagging policies, and we just kind of create a group. We'll show this in the demo, and then you might have some other policies that you don't group or you group slightly differently. And then lastly, that outer box is an initiative assignment, right? So there's a policy definition, an initiative definition where you bundle those up. And you can create those till you're blue in the face, and it will have no effect on your environment until you actually assign them somewhere, right? And as you'll see, where do you assign them? You assign them at a scope. You choose the scope, right? Do you want this policy to affect the entire management group structure? Do you want it to affect everything within a subscription? Or do you want to get more detailed than that? You can go to a more granular scope, all right? The last thing I'll say about this is when we do the demo, we're gonna pass some parameters. And it's the easiest place to get confused when creating a policy. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass a parameter from the assignment, the initiative assignment, to the initiative definition, to the policy definition. So you can hard code a variable at any point in there. Best practice is to try and pass those through, okay? So keep this as a mental image. So when I say, oh, we're gonna pass through the parameters, we're passing from the assignment to the initiative definition to the policy definition. Okay, just keep that in your mind. Let's dig into policy a little bit more. Remember I said a policy definition is a rule. Thou shalt not, right? These are the different effects that you will see and that you can use as part of a policy. I've tried to color code them, right? The audits are more of just like, tell me if something's not quite right. You have the deny, modify, append, deploy if not exists. That's more of a like, fix it, go fix it, you know? And that fixing, or prevent in the case of the deny, that happens in flight at deployment. That is injected into the ARM process. When you're doing a deployment, this policy is going to be evaluated against what is being sent through ARM, and it's either going to let it through or it's not going to let it through. And so that's the power of the blue ones. You want to be careful with that. You could break people's pipelines like that, right? And then on the right, these are more of kind of a manual thing. Disabled, basically, hey, I want to turn it off for some reason. And then manual is in preview. That's more of an attestation control. You know, you might have a control in NIST or CIS that says, hey, your operations team should have 3 or more members. I made that up. That's probably not in there, right? But it's something that Azure can't really figure out for you. But it's a place where you can go and attest, like, yes, we're meeting that control. I attest to it. It'll be tracked there. So it can be along other controls that Azure and technology can figure out. Okay. So we've talked about policy, like, okay, we've got it figured out. We know how policies work. We know what the effects are. We're going to go. We're going to do it. We're going to put a bunch of policies in place. You need to think through, is your organization actually ready for, to have this level of governance, right? Let's talk about responsibilities, or a RASCI chart of some fashion, right? Who's making the decisions, right? Who's saying thou shalt or thou shalt not, right? Is that the CISO? Is that someone from cybersecurity? Is that from somebody from your operations group? It might be everybody having different opinions, or it could be that you're actually grabbing the opinions from those different groups because you need to satisfy them all as stakeholders, right? But who's making those decisions? We talked about the different effects. Who's deciding if it's an audit policy versus an enforced policy where you're denying the action, right? Deny, like you're breaking deployments. If they don't follow it, you're breaking deployments. Audit, the deployment will go through and then they'll just kind of show up on the wall of shame and you go kind of, knock on their cubicle and say, hey, did you know your deployment broke the rules, Who's going to decide if that control, if that policy is audit good enough is deny really, really important. Who defines how quickly something needs to be fixed, right? Let's say it is an audit, and so the deployment succeeds, and it shows up on the dashboard, and, well, you're not compliant. Okay, well, how soon does that need to be fixed, and who decides that? Is that a week? Is that 3 months? Maybe it depends on severity, okay? Who decides on severity? You know, these are all things that you've got to figure out. How will you steward compliance, right? Who's looking at the reports and what are they doing with them? Let's say something's non-compliant. Who actually fixes it? You know, you probably don't want your central IT team going in and fixing some application developer's database. Like, oh, you left that unsecured. I apologize. Let me fix that for you. Click, and production goes down, right? That's not the way you want to do it. So you've got to figure out who's accountable and how do you keep them accountable, right? Tagging is a great way to do that, right? Like, oh, here's a resource. It's non-compliant. Let's look at the tag. Oh, that's this team. Let's tell them. Yeah, Adam.
What is tagging?
What is tag? Oh, I knew you'd do this to me.
Never
Tag.
heard of it. I'm not a
So tagging is exactly what it sounds like, in that you can basically add metadata to an Azure resource, right? Common types of tags, responsible party, you know, maybe a ServiceNow queue, could be a support email address, cost center, environment, thank you, dev, prod, something like that. All very, very popular tags to have. So you could use those to help figure out who should actually fix this that I'm showing is non-compliant. Yeah, question.
Not sure if this fits, but is there a way of telling you that if a person's in a certain role and they feel like they need this kind of permission to expand their role to do better, is there a way that the level above that can pick up that the person underneath keeps banging into this wall? And we ought to take a look at it.
I don't, if I'm understanding the question correctly, you have somebody, let's say it's a developer who's trying to do something and they just keep hitting a permissions boundary, that they don't have permissions to do what they should be doing as part of their job. Is that close?
Yeah.
So I don't know that there's like a easy button from a technology perspective to do that. There's a few different options. A lot of them are probably going to be like internal, organizational discussions and decisions of what those permissions need to look like. If it fit your scenario, there is an option to use something called privileged identity management. That's where you can temporarily increase your permissions, and you have to like provide justification. You can require, some sort of a change ticket. You can require an approval. That could help streamline that particular case. Again, if that meets kind of your internal policies and practices.
Yes, if you're just looking for instances of where that occurs, then diagnostics can do that. So if you enable the diagnostic settings for most Azure services, the diagnostics are written to a service called event.
Thank you.
Yeah. To the
Excuse me.
yeah, event
Event Hub, Log Analytics.
analytics. Thank you. I blanked. To log analytics, and then you can do searching and alerting on that.
Okay, I think the last thing I'll mention on this slide is be prepared to evaluate exceptions, right? We have these rules, thou shalt always do this. I guarantee you, if you're in a large enough company, you will run into a case where you cannot do that. And so you have to evaluate, is that okay or is that not okay? And again, who evaluates that? Who has that decision power to say, okay, you can do it this one time, or you can do it for a year and then you've got to really upgrade or fix that, Somebody's got to have that decision power. Okay, we've got that all figured out. We know who's in charge of what. We got our people all lined out. How about our processes? What's your management of change, right? You've got to think to yourself, what's the worst that could happen? Because the worst could happen if you're not careful with this, right? You could put a policy in there that deploys something that's either very expensive or is a breaking change, you've got to test this. I like to say that managing Azure policy is not a part-time job, not at an enterprise, not at scale, right? It's got to be somebody who knows what they're doing, and to be honest, a team of people who know what they're doing, who have rigor around their testing processes, and they have to be taking a feedback loop, right? Kind of that's that walk before you run idea. Like let's put it in audit mode and see what comes back, right? And we go start talking to our developers. Hey, we think this is really important, or cybersecurity thinks this is really important. What's the feedback? Do people say, "Oh, I didn't know"? Yeah, let's totally do that. Okay, great. Or is the feedback that'll never work, and here's why: you've forgotten all these things. You've got to be pretty methodical in that, and it truly can be and probably should be like a DevOps process, right? And you can all of these policies, they can be defined as code. They can be pushed as code. I mean, when you really get to that upper echelon of using policy, you want to be using a process like that. Anticipate impact on the business. Again, let's say you put a thou shalt. By this date, thou shalt make sure that this is nowhere in the environment. Is that quarter close? Is that year end? Does that mean that that development team can't deliver on something that the business is expecting? All those things have to be weighed. Okay, enough of the slides. Let's talk about policy in a demo. Okay. We don't have any questions, do we, Adam?
Online.
Okay. Let's jump back here. Okay, I showed you some RBAC. We're gonna close that. So, Defender for Cloud, I'm just gonna just touch on because July, correct, Adam?
Yeah.
There's gonna be this session will be on Defender for Cloud. I don't have enough time to do it justice, and we'll have it in a couple months. I did want to mention though that Defender for Cloud has recommendations. Some of them, you can see the secure score recommendations or all recommendations. These are based on what's called the Microsoft Security Baseline. And that is kind of an amalgamation of everything Microsoft has found in CIS, NIST, ISO 27001, brings them together and says, here's what you should be doing in Azure. Here's all the good things. It's very much a security flavor. Remember, security is one of those pillars of governance, but it's not the only pillar of governance. So Defender for Cloud, good place to start from a security perspective. If you have operational requirements, you're going to need to move over to Azure Policy. Now, I will say these recommendations are actually based on, most of them are based on Azure Policy. And I'll actually show you that. If I go to regulatory compliance, if you're a customer that, yeah, we like the Azure Security Baseline, it kind of has the best of all of these things, but we have to be held accountable by our auditors to this baseline. You can throw this in. Let me scroll down a little bit. You can see I've added in ISO 27001. I've added in PCI. Those are Microsoft provided regulatory compliance frameworks that you can add in. Also based on Azure Policy. So let's jump over to policy real quick. I'll show you those. We're going to spend a lot of time in policy, so don't get mad that I'm going to bounce out of here really quickly. But you can see right here, those three right there, those match up to what we just saw in Defender for Cloud. Azure Security Baseline, PCI, ISO 27001. And if you look over to the right, you can see these compliance numbers. Those, okay, I'm not doing so great. I need to go look at those. But those bubble up to Defender for Cloud too. And Defender for Cloud will put a nice wrapper around it, give you some other nice features that you can really look at those things. Because we're not going to talk about Defender for Cloud, we're going to talk about maybe more of an operational type policy that we want to do, okay? So I have my resource group here called Key Vault Demo. Great name, I know. And we have a key vault in here called MRBell Key Vault 1, and it's in West US, right? Well, let's say that the powers that be, maybe that's me in this case, say, I want all my deployments in East US. I don't want anything in West US. Furthermore, I want there to be a naming convention enforced. I don't like that name. I want an environment prefix on the names. In this case, I'm just going to do Key Vault. And this isn't meeting either of those, right? Okay, what am I to do? Well, I'm going to use Azure Policy. Okay, let's jump over to Policy again. Over here on the left, we're gonna bounce between all of these pretty much. So don't get lost that I'm not going in order. But if you think back to that visual I showed earlier, we're going to start at definitions. So, come on, Azure, you can do it. Okay, here we go. So these are, again, these are just definitions, and there's a lot of them, right? Microsoft provides a lot of these. You can create your own custom ones. We're actually going to do one custom one. These are available. They're not actually in use. They're not actually in place for the most part. So this is just where you can look at it. Okay. And if you remember, I said there were two policies I wanted to do. I wanted to do location East US, and I wanted to do some sort of naming convention, right? Well, let's search for location. And let's look, my resolution is messing with me a little bit here. If I scroll down here, here's a policy. It's called allowed locations. It's built in. That means provided by Microsoft. It's a policy, so it's not an initiative. You can actually see that in the logo as well, is that it's just a single document, right? And it's built in. And I think that's probably the ticket. Let's go ahead and look at it. So again, we're looking at the policy definition. Okay, there's some metadata up top. And actually, the metadata is kind of duplicated again down here. There's a parameter. I'm kind of reading the matrix here. Stick with me. There's a parameter that says, here's a list of all allowed locations. That sounds like what I want. Remember, I just want East US. All right, and then here's the policy rule. Oh, I gotta scroll down out here. Come on. Here we go. Okay, this is kind of the meat and potatoes of the whole thing. We have a policy rule, and you read it almost like code, but not quite, right? So here's an if statement, and here's the then statement, right? So if all of these things are true, so we're going to and them. They all have to be true. You can instead say any of, and that would be an or, but we're going to and them because it can say all of them. So if the location, and remember this is happening in flight during a deployment. I'm deploying involved. It's going to evaluate that ARM template that comes in, and it's going to say, okay, if that location field is not in what I passed in as a parameter, and that location field is not global, because some resources are non-regional, they are global, it's going to let them through. Now there's this third one you're noticing, right? And the type is not Microsoft Azure Active Directory B2C directories. So I don't know exactly what's unique about that resource type, but Microsoft has figured out that in this policy, that needs to be excluded, something unique about it, right? So if all three of those things are true, if the location is not in the right place, it's not global, and you're not deploying a B2C directory, then we're going to deny the deployment. It'll break the deployment. Now, keep in mind that deployment, that could be the creation, that could also be the update of that resource, right? So we're in business. This looks great. This is exactly what I'm looking for. We want to go use it. Okay. Okay, I got to scroll up here. The other one we wanted was something about prefix. I don't see anything there. Name. I don't see anything there. Okay, surprise, surprise. This one is not built in, right? We need to go create something to do this. So we're going to create a new policy definition. Definition location. again, thinking back to those scopes, where do you want it stored? The best practice here is to store it as high as you can, because it basically is saying, where can you use it, right? If you stored that at a really low level, it can only be used at a low level. Generally speaking, especially as we're talking about at scale, the definition, you're going to want to store that up high in the management groups, maybe at the tenant root group, so it can be used everywhere. Doesn't mean you have to use it everywhere. Remember, it's just the definition. It's not the assignment. So I'm just going to choose the tenant root group. That's where I want to store this definition. The name, I think I'm going to say environment. I'll probably misspell it. Environment prefix. Okay, I'm not going to worry about a description. Category, that's just metadata. You can create your own. You can see what's available. I'm just going to choose general. Okay, we come down here to policy rule. This should look somewhat familiar. This is just giving you a sample, right? This is not the right code because you can tell it's talking about location, and I'm talking about naming convention. Thanks to TV Magic, I happen to have a cake coming right out of the oven with perfect code, fingers crossed, that we're going to drop in here. Okay. You can already see this is a little bit longer than what we were doing before, but there's a very similar structure, right? I have some parameters. I'm going to take in the environment, and I'm actually saying here are the only things that are allowed to come in that parameter. I'm going to say you can send dev, prod, stage, or test. That's it. I have a second parameter, which is the effect, and I'm going to accept audit, deny, or disabled. Those are the only effects that I'm going to accept because they're the only ones that work or the only ones that apply. I also have a default value here called audit. Okay, let's go look up at the policy rule. Okay, again, here's kind of our if statement. If, then, and notice the effect is parameterized. That's actually a best practice to parameterize your effect, not to hard code it at this point. And all of, so we're going to AND these. If the type of the deployment, the resource type we're deploying is key vaults, I did that for the demo. You might want to be more broad if you again, test. And notice this one says field equals type. So that field can basically say, look at any field in that ARM template. Remember, this is in flight. The ARM template's coming in, being evaluated. Look at the fields. Resource type, the name of the resource, you can do all these different things. And field will just do a straight comparison. If you need to do some logic, then you just use value here. And you can see some logic here. To put this briefly, all I'm doing is I'm getting the first 3 characters of the name of the resource. And I'm saying, give me the first 3 characters and see if they meet my environment variable, right? So when this will all come together when we glue it together, but just to put this simply, if it doesn't start with dev, or it doesn't start with stage, or it doesn't start with prod, I'm going to deny it, or I'm going to audit it and say non-compliant, right? So there again, if it's a key vault and it doesn't start with the right prefix, okay, that's exactly what I'm looking for. I don't think there's any errors. Azure would generally tell me at this point if there were any errors. I don't need any role definitions. I'll come back to that later. The reason I don't need role definitions is because this is an audit or a deny policy. If it was a policy where we were actually trying to make changes to the environment, you have to grant permissions to actually go make those changes. So we're like, okay, no, we're not doing any kind of this like changing stuff. We're just straight up, stopping it or perhaps letting it go. Let's see how it goes. Okay, seemed to work. Let's go back to definitions. We're going to give a good old-fashioned refresh. Should be there. You'll find that with policy, some things you need to let them marinate for a little bit. Just creating a definition like that isn't one of them, but when you actually want it to go evaluate your environment, especially a large environment, it can take some time before the dashboards get updated. Okay, so if you remember, I'm trying to remember what I named it. Like named it environment. Oh, there it is right there. Environment prefix. Remember, we stored it at the tenant root group. You can see it's custom because we made it. It's not built in, not coming from Microsoft. Hey, we're ready to go. So we're going to expand out to that next box out, if you remember. We're going to create an initiative. Initiative location, same story. Generally, you're going to store that pretty high in your scope hierarchy, just so you can choose where to use it. I'm just going to call this one operations. Again, Defender for Cloud has a lot of the security stuff already in there, so don't reinvent the wheel, but it's probably not going to have your operations stuff, right? Like Defender for Cloud, I don't think is going to tell you should back up your virtual machine. It's not going to tell you, you're in the wrong region. It's not. It's really looking at specific security related stuff. Okay, so again, we're creating an initiative or a policy set. We're grouping policies. We are just going to put this in the general category again. This is just metadata. There's general right there. Next. Okay, what policies do you want in there? Well, think back. I want them only to be in East US, and I want them to have an environment prefix. Let's go find those policies. Okay, let's search for environment. Oh, come on. Oh, there it is, right at the bottom, last one. We're going to add that. We're going to add, we're going to search for location. Allowed locations. We're going to add that. Okay, those are our two. We can add them to groups. We're not going to worry about groups. We're just going to skip groups. Okay, just because there's only two. If you had 40 policies in here, which you totally could, might want to group them a little bit, organize. Initiative parameters. So for this, I'm going to come back to this because for this to make sense, let's go to policy parameters first. And this is where I was saying earlier, like, hey, we're going to pass parameters all the way through the chain, right? So you could hard code some of these things directly in the policy definition. Not the best practice. You probably want to parameterize it. You could hard code it in the initiative, or you could actually pass it all the way down from the assignment. So we see our policy parameters here, and hopefully these look familiar from the code we were showing earlier, right? So it's like, okay, what's the environment? And you can set a value. Notice I put those in there, right? Those are the ones that are available to select. Those are the only ones allowed. Same with locations. Look at that, all the Azure locations. That's nice. And then there's one, if you remembered, it had a default value already. So I don't have to pass something in. It'll just take the default if I don't want to, right? Okay, so those are the policy parameters, but we want to pass those through. I'm going to try and do this quickly. I'm just going to say environment. It's a string. I could specify what values are allowed. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to let anything through. I'm going to create another parameter. This one is going to be called effect. It's going to be a string. I could put in only allow audit and deny just to save time. I'm gonna kind of let whatever come through. And then I'm going to create another one called location. This one is not a string. This one's actually strongly typed. It's going to be an array of strongly typed objects of type Azure location. Notice this one. This is interesting. VM SKUs. Maybe you have a policy that says you can't create a VM that costs $10,000 a month. This is how you would do it. is I'm sure there's a built-in policy for this. And you just say, oh yeah, VM SKUs, these are the ones you're not allowed to use, or these are the ones that you're only allowed to use. You know, you can make that an allow list or a deny list, whatever you want. Okay, but we've got that strongly typed to location. We're going to hit save. Let's move back to policy parameters. So instead of hard coding it here, we're just going to say, no, we're going to use an initiative parameter, and the environment prefix, we want to be environment. The effect parameter, I'm looking at this. Let me highlight this just to make sure this is clear to everybody. I'm looking at this column here. Okay. The effect, we're going to use an initiative parameter, which should be effect. Allowed locations, we're going to use an initiative parameter. And notice because it was strongly typed, this one didn't even show up as available in the other dropdowns. But here it is. Okay, so here again, we're passing those through. And the reason we're passing those through is this is still an initiative definition. If I want to use this in multiple places, I don't want to have to create a new definition for each place I use it. At the assignment time, we will specify those values. Okay, let's make sure we didn't screw anything up, and we'll create the initiative definition. Okay, that worked. Go back to policy. We're done with definitions. Whew, okay, that was the hard part, right? We got our two controls that we want. They're ready to go. They're not doing anything yet. We actually have to put them in place with an assignment. So let's go to assignment. You can assign a policy directly. That is not a best practice. You should bundle them up into initiatives, just easier to manage that way. I'm going to assign an initiative. Okay, scope. I don't want to necessarily put the root management group on this one because this is the assignment. Where do I want this to actually affect the environment? For this demo, we're going to go into the application subscription, and we're going to go into the Key Vault demo resource group. That's where I'm going to assign this. It's only going to affect that resource group. Select. Exclusions, we're not going to exclude anything in that resource group where we're in there. Which definition do we want? Again, we need to search for this. I think I called it operations. There it is right there. That's that definition we just built. We add that. The assignment name, you're generally going to want to say your definition name and then the scope. So I'm just going to say Key Vault demo. Okay. Stick with me. We're almost there. We're going to enable it. Yeah, question.
On the assignment,
Yeah.
On the scope side, can you assign to something with a wildcard, like resource group with a certain prefix or certain text in it, or?
I do not believe so. I've never seen it.
I think so.
You could come up with something if you're real clever programmatically to find, but out of the box, I don't believe so. You need to say where you want it. Good question. Okay. Advanced, we're going to skip advanced for now. Parameters, these should look familiar, right? Environment, I'm going to say PRD. And what I'm saying is, for this assignment, you have to have a production prefix, right? The policy will let you have any of them, but right here I'm saying no. Maybe this is my production subscription. This is a production Key Vault. I'm making sure that it says production in the naming convention. The effect, I'm going to go ahead and say audit here. And the location, we're going to find East US. So here again, because we pass that all the way through, they show up here. If we hadn't done that step, it wouldn't even ask me because they're hard coded in that other definition. Come on, okay, remediation, we're going to skip. I'll come back to it briefly. Non-compliance message, I'm going to skip this just for time, but you can just say, what do you want to tell people if they run into it, right? And if they're in the portal and they're doing something they shouldn't, it'll pop up and say, hey, please follow this corporate guidance. You're not doing this. Or it'll show up in their DevOps pipeline. Their pipeline blows up. It'll show up in that pipeline log to say, please use the right naming convention or whatever you want to say. So those non-compliant messages will come through. Let's create this. Remember, we're creating an assignment. So this is actually taking an effect. Okay, as I mentioned, policy needs to marinate a little bit. Generally on an assignment, like a deny assignment, probably 2-3 minutes from what I've seen before it actually it'll start catching you. If I go to compliance, you'll start to see some of these assignments, and I've got several in here. Some of them I've done, some of them are being done for me. I should see, might need to refresh. Oh, there it is, operations. Operations Key Vault. The scope, applications / Key Vault demo, that's the resource group that we're working in, right? Compliant state, not started. This one definitely takes time to marinate, right? Because what it's going to check your existing resources to say, hey, what's already out there and are you good? Even if you have a deny policy there, if something is non-compliant, it's not going to go automatically change it. It will prevent you from making changes to it. It'll prevent you from redeploying it, but it's not going to go and change the stuff necessarily. I'm in here, non-compliant resources. Even though I know I have one, Azure doesn't know quite yet. We'll come back to that in just a second. Let's try creating another Key Vault that is non-compliant. I chose Key Vault because they generally provision pretty quick. Let's hope that is proven true. Give me a Key Vault. Okay, yep, that's where I want it, in that resource group. I'm just going to give it a bad name 1, see if that works. Location, Central US. I don't care about anything else because this is just a test, right? Let's review it. Uh-oh, validation failed. This is actually a nice thing in the portal. It didn't used to tell you in the portal. It didn't tell you until you went actually to deploy it and your page blew up. Now it's doing a little pre-flight check for you. Resource bad name 1 was disallowed by policy. Policy that it's offending is allowed locations. I have it in the wrong location. Now, what you're probably asking yourself, well, what about the bad name? I didn't give it a good name. That was an audit policy. So let's fix the location. Let's not fix the name. Let's go back to basics. East US. Review and create. Uh-oh.
East US 2.
Did I do the wrong one? My mouse
Yes.
my mouse is on this land.
You got to put on East US 2.
Say that again, I'm sorry.
The region should be East US 2.
Oh, is that what I selected in my
That's
phone?
what you set it up.
Thanks for keeping me honest. Yeah.
Teamwork.
East US 2 is the region I selected, as I planned.
People are awake though. Kudos. They're watching.
All right.
You're being watched, Molly.
Okay, so it already looks good. The pre-flight passed. I'm going to create this. This should work.
Always seems much slower when you're
Somebody's watching.
watching it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. We don't really want to go look at it, but let's go look at the resource group. Okay, so now what I have is 2 key vaults, both with bad names, one in the wrong region. Okay, let's go look at policy, compliance. Let's refresh this, see if we have anything in here yet. We may not. I'll force it if we don't. Oh, look, non-compliant. We have one non-compliant resource, and it's not compliant to both policies. That's exactly what I expected. That's the one that has been there for a while, right? So it's in the wrong location. It's got the bad name. I can force this to go recheck, but just given time, I don't want to drag you guys through that. If you don't force the issue, for sure within a day, probably within an hour, you'll start to see that compliance show up. So hooray for us, right? We're the cloud operations team. We showed those developers what was what, and we said, you've got to have your key vault's in the right or you got to have all your resources in the right location, and your key vaults have to have a naming prefix. Awesome. Yay for us. Well, we still have 2 that are non-compliant. This goes back to like, okay, well, what do you do, right? Like, who's going to go fix it? How soon does somebody need to fix it? And what if they can't fix it? Yeah, question.
So if they can fix it, are there ways of making exception? Exceptions.
I apologize. I need that again.
If there's no way to fix it, can you make an exception?
Well, that's where I'm going right now. I'll give you your $10 after the meeting. So, hey man, I created these key vaults. I've got 3 critical applications relying on this key vault. If I try and move it, if I try and rename it, all the production's down, you know, whatever. Okay. I convinced somebody that that's true. We go in here to policy, and you can say right here, create an exemption. Okay, the scope of that exemption is going to be at the assignment level or lower, right? If you have a policy that's pretty high, a management group subscription, you could say, okay, I'm going to give you an exception just down here where you say you need it. I'm not going to let you run wild everywhere else, right? You can actually grant an exception directly on a resource. And in fact, maybe that's what we'll do. So notice I can't change these up here because it's got to be at that scope or lower. Let's choose the resource. My first one. Select. Okay. Exemption name. Exemption category. You can kind of read what these 2 mean, like mitigated or waiver. Mitigated is generally more of a security thought process. Like, I know that I shouldn't be doing this, but I have these mitigating controls, and that's why it's okay, right? We're just going to say a waiver. You're definitely going to want to put a description. Why is this in here? This key vault is critical to these applications. It can't be moved until the next upgrade or something like that. And if that's the case, if it's time bound, which is awesome, go ahead and put an expiration, right? There's a warning like, hey, just so you know, this is going to take effect, you know, at the end of this time period, you know, come on, give me a date picker. We're going to say whatever. You've got 2 weeks to fix that before so-and-so comes and knocks on your cubicle and tells you to straighten that out, right? Maybe that's a year, whatever, you know, whatever you guys feel is the right thing for, again, the complexity of your environment and what you guys can manage. So we're going to give that an exception. Please put in a description. We're not going to talk about advanced. Okay, what policy do they need an exception to? Let's say you've got 50 policies all in this one initiative. Well, you don't want to give them an exception to everything. So you can get in here and get more granular and say, yeah, this one and this one, but not these others. Just for the sake of this demo, I'm going to give both of these policies an exception. And I'm going to hit create. That should create pretty quick. Let me open up Cloud Shell here real quick. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to run a PowerShell command that tells Azure Policy to say, hey, I know you're busy, but will you come and evaluate this for me? If you do that like for like something really, really big, it's still going to take a while. If you do it for something pretty small, then it'll come back pretty quick. Let me see if my up arrow's going to work for me. Up arrow. Yep. Okay. I'm just selecting the application's subscription and I'm saying start AZ compliance scan, and I'm just putting it in the background. Okay. So I'm going to minimize this. So if we sat here and watched paint dry, probably 3-4 minutes, what we'd see is 2 things. We would see one key vault with 2 policies that it's exempted from. So I think it's green, and maybe a different color of green, the exemption in that little pie chart. We would see another key vault that's green on one policy and red on the other. Because remember, we put it in the right location, but we didn't give it the right name. And so that's how those exceptions will play out. let me do an old-fashioned refresh, see if we can get lucky and see if it happened quickly. No, not yet. Okay. Questions about like the whole thing we just went through? If not, I'm going to throw some more kind of like best practices at you.
I did think of an answer to your question about how we could be more specific about, can you apply the scope to specific named resource groups? So the answer is still no, but you could have it in the policy definition, right? So you could apply it to whatever the scope is, management, wherever you know these resource groups are. But you could then have the policy definition look for the name of the resource group to match whatever the pattern you are looking to use when assigning it. If that makes sense. So you apply it to a whole bunch of stuff, but it would only actually action given the rules that you were looking to use when applying it. Resource groups end in X or whatever it is you were, whatever that is.
That applies to tags too then.
Yeah, you can apply it to tags. Having tags is a common one, right? So yeah.
You could definitely do that. It's a good idea, Adam.
Yep. So with certain tags, without certain tags, that's right.
Yeah.
You know, up to 16 tags on a resource. You can force having tags on a resource.
Yeah, you can force that with policy. Yeah.
Exactly. You can actually have policy add tags for you if they're not already there. Change them if you can do all kinds of stuff like that. Yeah. So possible with a little more work, but yeah.
One last thing I wanted to say before I left the demo, and I'm not going to demo it. I'm not set up to demo it, but we did audit, we did deny policies, right? There's another common one for specific scenarios called deploy if not exists. And so it's generally like, hey, you deployed this, but there's a sub item that needs to go along with it. So a common one could be like diagnostic settings on a resource. It could be an extension on a virtual machine. Those are the two biggest common ones that I'm aware of. And so this is like, hey, we're going to let this deployment go, but if you forgot to add this VM extension, if you forgot to add this diagnostic setting, we're going to do that for you. And again, that happens in flight as part of that ARM process, like that deployment. That all happens in flight. That's good and that's bad, and we'll talk about that in a second. So that's good. That's kind of a go forward type of effect. You know, if I put some sort of deploy if not exist policy in place for a key vault, the next key vault I create, boom, it's going to do it. But what about the key vaults that I had just already created? They're in the environment. For there, you can go here to say create remediation tasks. Those are pretty unique to those deploy if not exists policies. And it's basically like, hey, even though nothing is happening with this resource right now, go ahead and go slam that in, right? That sounds bad, right? I don't want to say it like it's a bad thing, but we're going to go, as it says, remediate those resources, right? So that's how you could remediate a deploy if not exists policy. That's where you need to grant permission so that the policy has permission to actually go make those changes to your environment. And you'll see that happened in the audit log. So you can make sure that you're seeing that. If it's something like these key vaults where it's not a deploy if not exists policy, well, then you got to do it yourself, right? As an individual, you got to go fix it. Okay, I just saw a question.
McKenna's got a question. Do these policies extend to containers deployed with an AKS cluster?
So the answer is they can. Azure Policy hooks into the Open Policy agent. And so there are some Azure policies, and they use the Open Policy agent as kind of that glue. I am not the expert on all that you can and can't do with that, other than I know that that part works.
Right, it has an extension that gets deployed to AKS, which you need to add, not added by default. And then there's a bunch of out-of-the-box AKS specific policies that know how to require TLS on your workload, for example, inside AKS, and will deny the deployment of that workload if the configuration is missing the TLS setting. And so And you can also, I think, you can add custom policies in the same way you can here. Those are within the scope of the cluster. Jordan's put a handy dandy link in there.
Thanks, Jordan. Okay. Let's jump back here.
Question, McKenna. Thank you.
So here's an example policy architecture. This might be good for medium size, might be partially good for a large enterprise. But let me just kind of walk through the thinking here, right? Let's say we're going to use Defender for Cloud. We think the Azure Security Benchmark is a great starting place. Great. That's actually a policy assignment. You don't go through the screens that we just went through, right? You do that through Defender for Cloud. Let's say you're a regulated industry. You're a bank in some fashion. You're a hospital in some fashion. Let's go hospital, right? You're going to put like the HIPAA regulatory compliance policy probably at the top, because probably all your applications are subject to HIPAA, right? And then if you have stuff that's above and beyond that, be it security, be it operations, you could create a custom policy, put it at that root level or some other high level management group. Those will cascade down. They'll affect every resource underneath it. Okay. Let's say underneath that root management group, you have a production and a development management group. And maybe your company policy is production is more stringent than the development environment. You know, it could be something like production environments must be backed up. Development environments don't have to be, right? You don't necessarily want to assign that policy up at that high scope because you only want it to affect that lower production management group, right? So that you can layer these things together, and as long as you don't conflict, right? If you put one up at the top that's like you can only deploy to East US and one at the bottom that says you can only deploy to West US, well, guess what? You're not deploying anywhere because they won't. One or both of them will stop you. And then let's go down a layer. Let's say you have a development subscription for application A. You have a production subscription for application A. This is something your central IT team probably wouldn't do for you. They're not going to have the intimate knowledge of your application. This is going to be more of the application team governing themselves. So let's say you're not a hospital. Let's say you're an oil and gas company, but you have some sort of a health system to keep track of employees' health while they're overseas or something like this, right? Well, maybe that application needs to adhere to HIPAA. So you would put that HIPAA policy down at this level. You wouldn't put it up at the top because you're an oil and gas company. You don't need HIPAA over everything, but you might need it at that lower level. Application A, hey, you know what? For this application, we are only deploying this size of VM. We are only deploying to this region. You can get specific, but there again, that's going to be somebody much closer to the application, you know, creating those requirements and governing at that low level. An example structure, we already kind of walked through this, right? Let's say we had an enterprise security policy. Some of these are probably already covered from Defender for Cloud, but maybe we say you're not allowed to put public IPs on network interface cards, and all NSGs have to, or all subnets have to have an NSG. Pretty common policies out in the world, right? And then you have a different group within that initiative that's all about diagnostic settings, right? Activity log, key vault diagnostics, storage account diagnostics, whatever, right? And so there you go. We've kind of already walked through how that structure works. Yeah, question.
Can I use either Azure Arc or something to that effect to extend this to on-prem?
Yes, I have not tested that extensively, but I do know that you can, especially like VM extensions, right? Let's say we're going to deploy, you know, the Azure monitoring agent to VMs in this subscription. If you hook up Azure Arc VMs into that subscription, guess what? They're going to get it. That's going to go down, you know, whatever your ExpressRoute, your site-to-site VPN, and you're going to deploy those on-prem as well, which can be a very good thing if that's what you're trying to do. Nice and easy, right?
Also works with Arc-enabled Kubernetes.
Yep.
You can that policy control.
So with Arc, it allows me to span any of the clouds as well as on-prem.
does.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay, let's talk through some quick technical implementation, like best practices, things you should do. Prefer built-in policies. It's real fun to like go create your own policy and make all the JSON. There's a lot of corner cases you might not think of. Microsoft is forced to think of and test those corner cases. So if at all possible, use a built-in policy. Microsoft's also going to keep that up to date, right? Let's say they add a new VM SKU, like they're going to make sure that their policy supports what the platform actually supports without you having to do that. Similar with custom custom roles for permissions. If you have a unique security requirement, go ahead and do it, right? But prefer the built-in stuff. Prefer audit and deny policies over append and dine. Deploy if not exists. These are the ones that like inject in flight. They modify the deployment in flight. That's really nice because it's like, hey, you forgot to do this. Let me do it for you, right? But then the code in the repo doesn't match what's actually deployed in the environment, right? So it's better to shift that left, right? If their pipeline blows up because they forgot to do something, they'll fix it. And they'll know that they fixed it and they won't make that mistake again. If you fix it for them, guess what? You're going to be fixing it for them for the next 5 years, right? And they're not going to know that they should have done it differently, could have done it differently, and they're not going to know that you're messing with their resource at deployment time, right? I touched on this one already. Anticipate exceptions. It's really easy to say thou shalt. This is always going to be true. It's not always going to be true. I don't care what the policy is, there's going to be an exception in a large enough environment. Some caveats. Be aware of managed services. Notice I say be aware. I don't say beware, be aware. AKS, Databricks, Azure Batch. These are services where Microsoft stands up infrastructure on your behalf, and then they prevent you from messing with it because they're actually kind of supporting it, right? Your policies could pick those up and say, hey, this NIC card on your AKS cluster doesn't meet your naming convention. Please fix it. You probably don't even have permission to do that, even if you wanted to, right? So you just have to plan to like, okay, yes, yeah, we're not going to fix that one. We're just going to grant those exceptions. So be aware of those.
Yeah, I'll pick on one that's a real life one that's taken down some production workloads at one of my customers, which was AKS. So they had a pretty sensible sounding policy in mind for standard load balancers, which has got nothing to do with AKS, whereby they wanted to prevent public IPs being added to the front of those things, like you might on virtual machines. Don't do that. Bad idea. Let's just ban them. So they banned that and broke their AKS clusters, which requires public IPs on standard load balancers. So lots of very bad things can happen through not knowing how some of these managed services use some of the what you might think of as unrelated services.
Good. Augment with automation. If you do this deep enough and long enough, you'll find something that Azure policy just doesn't do or doesn't do yet. That's where you might have to use a more of a traditional, like, okay, let's write a script that runs every day that looks for this bad thing. That's going to be the exception more than the rule. Like those don't necessarily scale, those types of scripts, but that is always an option to have like a function app or an automation account that goes and then you can run some really in-depth code and some kind of crazy analysis that maybe an in-flight ARM operation is a little bit tougher to handle with Azure policy.
I got an example of this one. So a common use case that you can't do with policy is when a resource is created, many customers want some sort of integration with an on-prem system they have, some sort of ITSM, some IT solution that tracks resources outside of Azure, right? And so that might require some kind of integration. And ordinarily, create a support ticket and say what the app is for and who created it and stuff like that. And you can't use policy to automate that because you don't necessarily know all that information, who created it and when and things like that. But with automation services like logic apps, you can have those triggered again when a resource is created, right? So you have it, it listens to the logs, triggers on creation, and then logic apps have the ability to, of course, look at the resources that are created, that know who created it, and anything you want to know, and they can then integrate with other services. Make a ServiceNow ticket, call a custom API you might have, anything you want, all kind of write stuff to a database, whatever you want, all automatically triggered maybe one time with the creation of resources. So just like policy, but of course with a lot more power and flexibility there.
Cool. Jordan had a question.
You did. Can you talk about the interaction between Azure policy, especially deploy if not exists, and the Terraform state file? Things that are deployed via policy would not be in the state file.
Yeah, I think that's similar no matter if you're using Terraform or not, right? What's in your repo is not what is in reality deployed. Terraform is probably a little bit worse in that case because it's going to do some check and say, hey, here's all the things I'm going to change. And it might try and undo what the policy is doing. And then it deploys and then the policy does it again. I mean, you could definitely have some infighting between those two because of that state file.
Who would win? Policy would win.
Policy would probably win because honestly, Terraform is just translated into ARM
right.
at the end of the day.
Yeah,
so
it doesn't matter how you create the resources, Azure CLI, PowerShell, Portal, Terraform, ARM, Bicep.
Good question, Jordan. So we are going to get out of here on time. I just have one more slide really after this. We've spent a lot of time talking about preventing things. Don't let people do this. Don't let people do that. So governance also needs to take into account how do you enable people, right? Preventing people from doing stuff doesn't generally make your company money, right? You've got to enable that. So we could talk about DevOps for days and days and days, which we're not going to do. But as an organization committed to doing governance in Azure, you got to ask yourself, what are you going to do to help your developers, right? Let's say you put 1 million policies in place. Well, why don't you give them some infrastructure as code that adheres to the policies? Say, hey, here's your starting point. Use this template, right? Obviously, we want to encourage the use of infrastructure as code. Enforce it if you can, especially in a production environment. So that's very, very good. Give them templates. Say, yeah, I know we have these 40 policies that say don't. Here's a database template. Here's a web app template. Here's a server template that adheres to all of them, so that you don't run into those things. And again, DevOps. We could spend weeks on DevOps. That's all I'm going to say about it. Other than you should be helpful more than just hurtful when you're doing your governance, as much as you can. And with that, I will take any questions.
That clock changed to 7:30. It's ding.
Yeah, I planned it that way. Anything, throw them at me. I don't know everything, but I'm happy to answer any questions, or you can ask me afterwards. Stick around, whatever.
Do many Azure customers use third party to control the policy? Third-party software.
I'm going to say yes. I don't know a percentage of how many do or do not, but they definitely can. A key difference between a third party and Azure policy, and there's pros and cons, right, to either. Azure policy is injected into that ARM operation, so it's going to deny something from happening if that, if that's what we do. We do a deny policy. Boop, full stop. Didn't even make it in the environment. All the other tools, the way they work is they're reading the audit log, similar to what Adam just described. They're reacting to something that happened in the log. Like, I just saw a public IP pop up, run some somewhat arbitrary code to evaluate if that's okay or not. And if it's not okay, it goes and deletes it. That happens pretty quick, and maybe that's okay. That's just a key difference of how they work. One's kind of detect and remediate. Policy, just given that it's first party, it can deny upfront.
So to give an example, I wrote a script, Azure function that we called the Reaper function. And it did exactly that. And going to your comment about tags, if it didn't have a tag that looked for a change code, so every deployment had to have a change request ID associated with it. If it didn't have a change request ID, and as it was created, after it was created, it disabled it. It would either disable it, or if it can't be disabled, it would delete it and force that recreation. And it ran every 10 minutes. So like you could quickly just delete everything if you didn't actually use that tag. But that forced our developers to then be in our infrastructure teams to say, every time we deploy, this tag is required.
Yep. And you can buy third-party tools off the shelf that do a lot of those.
Yeah.
Those same things, and the architecture of all of them is pretty similar. It reads the log and then takes some action, which in some cases is more powerful, because you can basically run arbitrary code. You could do whatever you wanted if it detects that. Azure policy, it's really very, very structured in what it can do in flight. Going back to some of those caveats we talked about.
More questions? Any more questions online? Doesn't look like it.
Okay, give it to you, Adam.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah. Thank you, Marlene. Thank you.
All right. Well, who learned something? Anyone learn something? Okay, good. Yeah. Then an evening worth it, right? Okay. Well, thanks all for coming out. So next month actually might be quite a fun one, because has anyone heard of AI? Yeah, seems to be that we get a lot of questions about that. So anyway, next month is going to be AI. So we're going to do OpenAI and its use in apps. So we're going to double it, because there's the AI services, so you can do some AI stuff, and then an example of a custom app that uses the AI stuff to do some clever stuff. So anyway, we're planning that for next month. We're focused on trying to be a second Tuesday of each month, incidentally. So I haven't posted that one yet, but that'll be the date. And then you heard we're going to do one on Defender for Cloud. So that the whole is a slew of services that cover a bunch of Azure features, and also Sentinel, which is another security related product. So that one actually is August now. We haven't figured out July yet. So, all right. Well, thank you all for coming out. Really appreciate everyone being here, and I hope to see you next month. Thank you all.
So you're going to keep us going over the summer?
Yeah,
Good.
sure am. As long as I get speakers and people to sponsor the food. And people to come with. And people that come out. That's right. Yeah. Okay. Thanks all. There's still some. Oh, I shouldn't. Thank you, everyone online. We appreciate you all coming out.